This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Well, my guest today, Rick Hawkins, is an Emmy-winning screenwriter whose decades-long career in Hollywood includes successes as a producer, head writer, studio executive, and international media consultant. Beginning with The Carol Burnett Show, where his now iconic Went with the Wind sketch contains the longest sustained laugh in television history, Rick went on to pen the ABC telefilm The Love Boat, which piloted the long-running series. Rick's writing credits include landmark variety series and top-rated sitcoms and dramas, for which he's earned 7 Emmy Award nominations, winning 1 for The Carol Burnett Show, and 5 WGA Award nominations, too. He's executive-produced TV series such as Sister Sister, Major Dad, and Punky Brewster. Rick has penned the book for several musicals, including Lunch, which had its West Coast premiere in January of 2014. He's also served as lecturer and teacher at UCLA and at the University of Moscow, as well as the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Warner Brothers Comedy Writing Workshops. Rick is currently serving as a senior teaching artist in the Cinema Arts Department right here at Point Park University, where he teaches screenwriting and where, as his colleague, I have had the great privilege to work with him daily for a number of years. Well, it's my great honor to have Rick on as my guest on StoryBeat today. Rick, welcome.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be finally on your podcast,
Finally,
Steve.
we got you here.
From listener to participant.
Well, I'm glad somebody's out there listening. You're the one. So what I always like to open up with is, how did you get into this business? What was your inspiration to start you into the business of writing?
It's interesting, and I try to explain this to my students. When my earliest memories in growing up for film and television were they were these magical things that came along one time and then they were gone. When I was first watching television, there weren't reruns.
Of course not.
You'd just watch an episode and then it would be gone.
And you couldn't record it.
No, there was no. The old days.
That's the old days.
So my earliest memories were making up my own episodes of shows that I was watching, or if I went to a movie, continuing the story of the movie.
Is this as a young boy?
As my earliest memories. Before I could actually write, I would use like my Army Men and Dinky Toys, and I would just act them out. I would just play the stories.
You were storytelling from very early
right.
on.
And then once I was able to write, then that was that's all I wanted to do. When I was in the 3rd grade, we had an assignment to do a report on George Washington. And so I asked the teacher, can I make it a play? Because that's what I thought TV and movies, I thought they were just, plays.
In a way they are.
And she said, well, okay. So I got a big F on it because in my version, George Washington's little brother is the one who chopped down the cherry tree, and he was lying to protect his brother. So there was this, I kept saying to her, it's a better story. The irony is he's saying I'm not lying, but he's lying, but it fell on deaf ears. But so I always have been writing scripts.
So your first love was actually watching TV. That's how you got into this.
It is my first, stories. Those are my first love, but TV got me hooked on it.
And so when did you actually formally start to write? As a little boy? Or
Yes.
So you were actually writing these things down on paper?
Yes.
So that means it was in your system from probably before you can even remember.
I was born an addict.
Addicted to TV, addicted to plays, addicted to
stories.
Writing stories. Yes, indeed. So who are your artistic heroes? who do you look back on, or even now today, you think to yourself, who's somebody that I emulate, admire, think about, read about, etc.?
Oh gosh, there's so many, so many people. And I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of people that were heroes, and I didn't even know it. I worked with Bill Richmond, who wrote a lot of the Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis movies.
Sure.
And Gene Parrott, who was one of the head writers for Bob Hope.
Absolutely.
And of course, I worked with Carol Burnett and Harvey Korman and Tim Conway, who were all people that I had watched on television before I actually did their show. Shakespeare, Dickens, the Bible, any good story was inspirational to me.
Okay, so you would have somewhat of a difficulty, I would think, working with people that wrote the Bible, or
I didn't work with too many people that wrote the Bible or were in it.
Okay, good. So when you when you finally got to the Carol Burnett Show, which of course is your first major gig, when you got to the Carol Burnett Show, and here were these people that you had admired from TV. How did you deal with that? Were you calm?
I was tongue-tied. I threw up every morning before I left for work. Once I arrived at work, I must have lost 20 pounds doing that show. I was so nervous, and I was totally afraid every moment that somebody was going to come in and go, wait a second, this is that kid from Louisiana. What are you doing in show business? Get out of here. And I never actually got over that feeling the whole time I was in LA.
So even as you had gone on to executive produce shows, you still felt like that?
My heart would race every time I would drive up to the studio gates thinking, this time they're not going to let me in.
They're going to discover that you're actually a fraud and
yes,
you shouldn't be
exactly,
here. I think that's probably a true thing for a lot of writers, don't you?
Maybe. And maybe a better way of saying it is you never lose that thrill of getting through the gate.
And wouldn't you say part of that is every time you write something new, you're reinventing the wheel every single time, so that it always is, can I do this again?
Right. Is this really any good? That I've proven it the last time. Is this story worth telling?
And if you don't prove it again, or don't prove it several more times, you're going to be out of work anyway.
More than likely.
So it's a pretty brutal business in that way. That we know for sure. When did you first get paid? When was your first professional paycheck? What year?
My first professional paycheck was as a grocery sacker at the A&P.
I'm talking about as a writer.
Oh, as a writer. I was hired from college to do the Carol Burnett Show, but before I actually started writing on the Carol Burnett Show, Joe Hamilton, who produced the show, was producing a summer replacement comedy show for a Canadian stand-up called Kelly Monteith,
yes.
The Kelly Monteith Show, and that was my first check. He put me on that show to see if I knew what I was doing, and I fooled him.
And we've talked about this before, and I think it's a fascinating story, the fact that you, which I think is highly unusual, straight out of college walked right into the Carol Burnett Show. Yeah,
it was a whole different time than exists now, a whole different time in show business.
It would be highly unlikely today, wouldn't it?
Well, it would, yes, because every show is not allowed to accept material that hasn't been submitted by an agent.
Right.
And I just sent in a script from a college thesis that I had done saying, my professor said this was good, and so I'm sending it to you.
You sent it in what is known as over the transom.
Yes.
Unattached to anybody who had, previewed it in some way.
Right.
And so today it has to go through a vetting process.
Exactly.
And
that protects the writer as well as the producer.
I imagine that there are probably some examples where, let's say, somebody knows a producer on a show, and the father knows a producer.
Oh, sure.
And they get their kid's stuff read without it being through an agent.
Right, or their cousins, or their own.
But the notion of that person being good enough to suddenly waltz onto a show, that's probably not going to happen too frequently.
This is the real thing, is that once you get it to somebody, it better be in the best possible shape that you can get it, or
you're done.
You only get that chance one time.
Absolutely. Well, I truly admire, and in some ways I'm a little envious of the fact that you got in there at such an early age. Do you think getting in at as an early age as you did, do you think that impacted the way that you looked at the world of Hollywood as opposed to the way someone who maybe struggles for 4 or 5 years and gets in? Do you think that you saw Hollywood differently?
Well, absolutely. I had no training at all in writing, in screenwriting, in teleplay writing. I knew nothing of how show business worked at all. And so I definitely skewed how I behaved, what I understood.
So your good fortune was these folks took you under their wing.
Oh, it was the blessing of my life that these comic geniuses were so generous with their talent and time and teaching and mentoring me.
And in your long experience in the business over the long haul, would you say that the majority of people you worked with were like that, were generous and kind and thoughtful?
Yes,
So
without question.
So once those folks got into those positions, they didn't turn into mean-spirited, terrible people.
Particularly in television, because time is the enemy. You have to do so much in so little time. The people who are really good at it don't waste their time. All of those dramatic things that we see in television, the evil, blah, blah, blah. There's no time for that foolishness. You've got a show to do.
Right. I mean, you hear stories every once in a while about somebody going off the rails, but you didn't have that experience.
No, not with anyone I ever worked with.
Well, that, again, I think
people always want to know
lucky.
the horror stories, and I'm like sitting there twiddling my thumbs.
You don't have any horror stories. Okay. So at what point after you'd been working for a while, did you think to yourself, I got this. I know how this works. I'm pretty decent at doing this.
I'll let you know when that happens.
You and me both, because I still don't know whether I'm decent at it or not.
And also, all of show business, but television in particular, is so constantly changing that you have to be flexible and open creatively to how you've done things.
So I think you're saying something that's very valuable for our listeners, which is you should never rest on your laurels. You should always be thinking to yourself, how am I going to get better at this? Or are they going to figure out that I don't know what I'm doing? Or all of those things are very valuable for someone who's starting out in the business to be thinking to themselves, I'm never actually going to arrive. I'm always going to be on the journey.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So obviously,
well said.
Well, thank you. Occasionally I get lucky. So you've worked on some of absolutely the most beloved TV comedies of all time, certainly Carol Burnett. And for those who have no idea what it's like to work on a sitcom, can you kind of describe what the days are like?
Well, of course, it's different on each series and how the series is shot. But let's say basically a half-hour comedy in front of a live audience. Generally, you do a Monday to Friday schedule. And sometimes it's Wednesday to Tuesday, but it's a 5-day schedule. There's a reading Monday morning. Then you rewrite. After the reading, you get everybody's notes. Tuesday, they put it on its feet, and you see a rehearsal at the end of the day Tuesday, and then you rewrite all Tuesday night to make it better.
Right.
On Wednesday, there's a run-through with the studio and with everybody, slightly more like it's going to be when it's on the air. And then you get more notes, and you rewrite Wednesday night. Thursday's camera blocking, where you make any changes that are needed technically. And then Friday, you do 2 or 3 performances of the show, depending upon the length of the show.
And you would do those 2 or 3 performances in order to get variations?
Yes.
So that you can then cut up and then get your best performances.
With a comedy show, if you have, just say, 2 audiences, the writers are backstage listening to how the audience reacts to jokes. And if you think it could get a bigger laugh, if you think the joke could be funnier, you're constantly changing it.
So you're actually making changes on the fly.
Sure. And hats off to these actors who get pages and jokes and have to go out and instantly do them.
And they do it. They're literally handed a joke and go out and reperform it.
They do it like they're breathing.
It's awesome, isn't it?
It's amazing to work with talented people.
And especially when they do it and they're funny.
Yes.
Which is a whole other
which is
level.
the purpose, too, right?
Of course. Well, okay, so now as an executive producer, I assume you have much more to do during a week than that. You're working you're worrying about editing shows you've already shot. You're worried about shows that are coming up, correct?
That's right. Well, what I was just describing is the show you're shooting this week.
Sure.
When you're executive producing a show, you don't actually start shooting the show until maybe the beginning of August, but the writers begin in May. Once you know your show's been picked up, the writers get to work and start planning out and writing the drafts.
Well ahead of production.
Well ahead of production, so that you're continuing to develop new stories, rewrite stories that have already been written, as well as doing post-production on the shot that the show that you shot last week,
Right.
and planning the final stages of the show that you're going to be shooting the following week.
So you're in sort of a constant running stream of events.
Sort of juggling 3 or 4 shows at the same
All
time.
right, so that, to me, that sounds like a lot of pressure. Did you find that pressure packed for you?
It's time consuming.
Meaning you're working long days.
You're working long hours, but if it's something that you love to do, I never felt, my pressure was wanting it to be the best it could be.
Okay, so your pressure wasn't on delivering in a timely manner. It was more on the quality of it.
Right. Because I'm a story whore. I'm a story addict. So dealing with lots of stories is like a joyful experience.
All
for
right.
me.
So my assumption is that occasionally things would maybe get behind, or you were in trouble on things because you are on this time. You're on
or stories get thrown out.
Sure, and you're on a fixed deadline. You can't change the deadline, really. I mean, I guess
Right, no.
Under a truly extenuating circumstance you could, but generally speaking you can't. So how would you handle that sort of added pressure? What would you do? Is there any kind of trick or technique that you had?
I grew up in a military family.
Okay.
So we soldier on. It's just you get the job done. You don't waste time freaking out.
Because it doesn't really solve any problems.
Right. It just wastes energy.
Me, I have a tendency to get faster, and everything speeds up, and it gets a little more intense. And so everybody handles it differently.
And often from these off the cuff, last minute things, genius happens.
Can you give us an example of something?
When I saw on your face you were going to ask me that, and I can't off the top of my head.
All right. Well, maybe if you think of it as we're going along.
Yeah, it'll come back.
I know.
to
I'm
me.
throwing your curveball there, but I know that over time you've had examples in your life where you were working at the last second and up came this great idea, or as you worked on the Carol Burnett Show, Harvey Korman or Tim Conway would throw in something live going out and crack everybody up, and of course the show is famous for that. So I think some of the most rewatched things in the history of television are from the Carol Burnett Show.
Could be.
I think it has to be. I think some of that stuff is still
genius. I know that they show the dentist sketch in dental schools.
Uh-huh. Oh, they show it in dental school.
Yeah, yes. Where he shoots himself with the Novocaine.
Oh, yes. And everything goes limp. He's not really working much anymore, but he was brilliant when he was gone. Tim.
Oh, and Harvey as well.
All of them.
The straight man is always the one who's underestimated.
Absolutely.
The reactor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So of all the shows that you've ever written, and we can take them show by show, or you can overall it, doesn't matter. Is there one episode of something that stands out as your favorite?
Absolutely. And when I tell you the story, you'll understand. There's one that's just the obvious choice. In the mid-'80s, I was working on this children's show on NBC called Punky Brewster, and it was the first and probably only primetime network show that was geared for children. Mm-hmm. And it was Dickensian in tone. It was sort of taking children's worst fears and having this little girl face them and overcome them. But it was also educational too. And I wrote an episode about teaching children to do CPR.
Okay.
And it was a well-remembered episode from the Punky Brewster because her friend gets trapped in a refrigerator and passes out.
Right.
And in the story, the kids were all making fun of learning CPR, and then in their life it had to happen, and Punky gave CPR to this girl and saved her. So it was like seeing it executed twice.
Sure.
So we did that episode, and the show aired on Sunday nights. And on Tuesday morning, the Tuesday morning after that show aired, I got a phone call from a woman who was so glad that she had found me. I don't know how she got to me, to say that her husband, who worked for the power company in Michigan, had fallen on the job from a power pole just as kids were getting off a school bus, and the children administered CPR to this guy and saved his life. And she said, so I'm calling to thank you for my husband and my children's father. So award, Shamord. Forget about awards.
It's easy for you to say.
Forget about awards. This was truly the best episode I ever wrote.
You saved a life.
Yeah. I mean, how many comedy writers can say that?
Well, I don't think too many. Although you never know. You never know. So, all right. So the old line has always been, dying is easy, comedy is hard. And I know it's almost impossible to define. And I've asked other comedy writers this question, but do you know what makes comedy so difficult to do well?
I can make this observation.
Okay, good.
Because I don't really consider myself an authority, but
you are, Rick.
There is a certain result from comedy. You want people to laugh, and in order for somebody to laugh, they have to be properly surprised or identify with an exaggeration of something, but it all comes down to telling the absolute truth.
Interesting.
And in drama, often you can fake telling the truth and people are won over.
Sure.
In comedy, it's impossible. It's either going to make somebody laugh or it isn't.
Well, that's the actual bottom line definition of comedy. It either makes you laugh or it doesn't.
Right. Well, that's the hard part.
Yeah, sure. That is the hard part. So in other words, you think of yourself then in some ways as a truth teller.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So and
which is why I think that good storytelling is good storytelling, whether it's comedy or drama or web series or radio.
Well, you'll get no fight out of me on that. Absolutely, I agree with that. Good storytelling is good storytelling. The question is, how do you take what is good storytelling and make people laugh with it? And that's, do you feel like you were always funny even as a kid?
I don't think of myself as a funny person at all.
And so what is it then that you're able to do in your head that then takes something and makes it funny? And it's not just performance, although that's a big part of it.
On my desk at home, where I do most of my work,
right,
I have my school picture from the 3rd grade.
Okay.
It's a doozy. That alone is enough to make you laugh. He's who I make laugh. He's my arbiter.
Really?
The kid with the army men. If I can amuse him, it generally works everywhere else. It's like before I would pitch, when you go to the network to pitch.
Right, sure.
I have 4 wonderful children. I would always do my pitch as a bedtime story to my kids the night before. And if I could get them interested or if they understood it, I felt like the general network executive might be able to understand too.
So you were able to pitch to your young kids? They were young? And so you were working on shows, obviously, that had not a lot of really seriously adult themes to them then, or did you not worry about that?
I mostly worked on the major television networks where adult themes were not. You had to make people laugh without getting smutty.
So in other words, you weren't. Of course, it's not in your resume. You weren't working on shows like a Veep or something that had a really nasty streak to it. I guess.
Right. Although I would love to be on the staff of that show. I love that show.
And any kind of show like that, BoJack Horseman or shows like that are really nasty.
Adult or adult
truly
themed.
Truly adult. Also, when you're working on comedies, there's a tendency for you to maybe work alone on because you never partnered with anybody as a comedy writing team, did you?
Early on, I partnered with on the Carol Burnett Show. They would team people up. There were 14 writers, and so often they would team people up. And I was teamed with a wonderful comedy writer, Liz Sage.
Okay.
She did Golden Girls.
Yes.
So I've worked with partners before.
All right, good. This is a good question. Then what makes good collaboration work?
That's like saying what makes a good marriage work.
That's a good question. What would you
sometimes?
So let's ask it this way: How would you make it work? What would
sometimes
you do?
Opposites attract in a marriage and in a comedy partnership. You each look at the world slightly differently, or even extreme extremely differently, and that conflict causes the comedy. Other times you see things exactly the same, and you know what triggers the other person.
Did you? What I'm trying to get at is, and that's great. That's very valuable. What I'm trying to understand is, let's say that you are working together and you are not gelling on an idea at all. You're not coming together on it at all.
Then you throw it out.
You throw it out.
Yeah.
So that becomes the cooperative part of collaboration. And, of course, a lot of it's cooperative. Did you ever find yourself feeling like you weren't getting your stuff through, somebody was dominating you, and whether in the room or whether with an exact partner?
No, but because you've worked with me, you know that this is true. I tend to be very vocal.
Definitely.
Loudmouth is another way of saying it. So my concern was always that I wasn't dominating or overpowering the people that I was working with, that I would shut up and listen to what other people had to say.
So your experience is that most people never overtopped you.
Right.
Because I know you know what I'm talking about.
I do know what you're talking about, yes.
There are people that get into a comedy room around a table, and they're the shouters, the yellers, they're the dominant persons in the room, and there are people that are sometimes the quiet ones who are actually the geniuses.
Who they open their mouth, and it's genius.
Well,
yes.
most famously, Neil Simon, the recently departed Neil Simon, famously during his work with Sid Caesar, was the quiet one in the room. And of course, he's maybe arguably the great genius.
Right.
Although that room was filled with actual geniuses from Woody Allen to Mel Brooks and so on. But collaboration to me is a very fascinating thing because I've collaborated with many people in my career, and it's always different. It is like a marriage. It is like dating someone. You have to act in a slightly different way than you do by yourself in a room. And you are now collaborating, as we all do, working at a school, same kind of thing. And the question, I guess, in this case is, are you able to, if you have an idea and it's not being put through and you know you're right, do you have any tricks or tips or techniques to get your idea heard in a way that gets it through?
In every writer's room, in every professional situation I've been in, what makes them successful is there is ultimately one arbiter, one person who decides yes or no. And being successful in a comedy room is learning to take no for an answer.
Interesting. Learning, that's a very good point. Learning to take no for an answer, which is not always easy for a person with a big ego.
Didn't say it was easy, but it's important.
Because you're good at that. I've seen that over time, that you are actually good at taking no for an answer, though you will continue to sometimes fight, as I will, for what we want to get through. But you're not the kind of person that gets up and drags somebody across the room and says, "Hey, you listen to me." That's not your style.
No.
Nor mine, actually, although we both of us are fighters for what we want to get done. No question about it. What would you say are the advantages of collaboration, and what do you think are the disadvantages of collaboration?
Well, the advantages of collaboration are obvious and limitless because you have all of these creative minds working together. Mm-hmm. And if you're if the person who's running the room or in charge of the collaboration has been able to impress everybody that we're all on the same page doing something, you have all of these creative perspectives of the same thing that just enhance it, that will take a good idea and make it a great idea.
Absolutely.
So you get all these different, it just makes it more wonderful.
And are there disadvantages to it? Is there anything you can think of that is a reason why maybe you shouldn't collaborate on something?
If you're inflexible, let me phrase this not in such a negative way. If your artistry is something that is so pure that it needs to be exactly as you see it, mm-hmm. The collaborative process maybe is not the most satisfying or best way for you to put your art out there. Writing a novel, although even writing a novel, you're going to get editors
Absolutely.
And people giving you notes. But
that's exactly what I was looking for, Rick. I was looking for, there are certainly great writers in the world that just don't. They're not designed to write with other people. Novelists in particular generally don't collaborate, though you see some partnerships out there occasionally on novels.
President Clinton.
President Clinton, yes. That's I'm not so sure that he wrote too much on that, but you never know. And so same thing with playwrights. There are lots of great playwrights
Sure.
should not be collaborating with anyone. And that was what I was getting at, is in comedy there tends to be many more partnerships than in drama.
Yes, that's true. Because you have somebody to say, is this funny?
You're feeding off of each
Right.
other.
If you make the other person laugh, you think, okay, this is a start.
That then becomes the marker of
Right.
whether it's comedy or not, that it makes somebody laugh.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm sure that in your time you've had any number of dealings with studio executives.
Oh, yes.
A few. And you've been given notes over time, and I'm sure you've been given notes that either were big questions to you, I don't understand this note, or I don't understand how to execute the note, or it's just flat out wrong for what we're doing, something like that. When you're dealing with someone who is your, I guess, superior,
right.
What was your method for dealing with that to get what you were trying to get done?
It's a great question, Steve.
That's one.
No, they've all been great questions. As I was saying, when I first started working, I had no clue about how show business worked, what anybody's job was, any of that. And for me personally, it was learning what the studio person's position and job was, looking at it not as they're criticizing what we're doing, but why are they here? What is their perspective? What is their job for the network? What is behind the note that they're giving?
In some ways, the politics of the situation.
You could say that, yeah. But I'm more practically speaking, what's behind the question? What's behind the criticism of the script?
Right.
And they may not be wording it in the way that's going to get them what they want. You could change that line to something else, but what they're really looking for is to pull in a larger audience or to appeal more to teenage viewers, let's say. Whereas you could solve their problem in a different way than they're suggesting, but they're still happy.
So in this case, you're trying to serve that master as well. In other words, their taste, what it is they're trying to accomplish. They may have an agenda that you don't know about that's part of even above them.
Right. Any criticism that you get from something that you've written is positive feedback because you're getting a reaction.
What a good way to look at it.
A story, it's like a tree falling in the forest. The whole idea of telling a story is relating something to your audience. And so what you get back from your audience is helping you understand how to do your job better. It's not your story isn't good, what you've written isn't good. Their feedback is so helpful in making you do your job better.
Did you always think that every note you got was helpful? I mean, you said it like as if every note was gold, and I'm not sure you probably had that experience.
Well, there are different degrees of being helpful.
Okay.
So maybe not all gold, but anytime somebody tells you something about what you've written, it's their response to something you've written. It's the audience's reaction.
Did you ever get a note and you thought, this is the most ridiculous note I've ever heard? Anything like that, or never?
Oh, I'm sure that there were notes from the network that we felt made the show suffer in some way in order to accommodate. When I've been doing this for so long, when I first started writing, there were broadcast standards and practices.
Still are for the networks. There are
at the networks where you weren't allowed to say certain things or have character. For example, when I Love Lucy was on, they couldn't say the word pregnant.
Right. Or show two people
right.
in getting into the same bed.
So I was on a show where you could say damned if you were talking about damning something, condemning something.
Right.
And you could say hell if you were referring to the place where Satan lives.
But not hell no.
Right, exactly. So there were these rules that often made your characters have to talk in a way that didn't seem natural or honest.
Sure,
So
great.
There were those kind of notes, but you have to move past it and go on.
Okay, so now you're working along in the business, and something has come along, and like you said before, a script gets canceled right before you're about to shoot, or a whole chunk of it's canceled. Can you do you have in your head any stories about just a complete disaster and how you saved the day?
No.
No. So in other words, you never got into that where there was something that happened to you where it was just a total mess, and there was a methodology or some way that you used to bail yourself out of trouble.
Well, no, except that every week when you do a show, it's an act against nature. It's impossible to do a show.
Every week is a potential disaster.
Yeah.
But every week the whole thing pulls through, right?
Yes, you always manage to get through.
Well, I've been doing theater an awfully long time, and
it is the same with theater too.
It's the same thing, and you can literally be in a theater or on a set, and you're 3 hours away from shooting or from the curtain going up or whatever that is, and the theater is a mess, and the backstage is a mess, and the people can't find their costumes, and blah blah blah, and somehow the miracle of show business,
magic of show business,
is magical, isn't it?
That performer who doesn't get it, can't remember their lines, is in dress rehearsal, you're thinking, oh my God, do we recast? And the cameras turn on, the audience arrives, and it's the most brilliant performance ever. I did a sitcom where one of the actresses would immediately get her script and mark through all the parenthetical directions on how a line should be read. It's the first thing that it was an actress, the first thing that she did. And it would drive us crazy. And she would almost always play opposite whatever it was that we put. And we were insulted and we were annoyed. In looking at the show in syndication and in reruns, hers is the performance that's the most fascinating.
I think that makes enormous amounts of sense, because that's the performer, and that performer at the end of the day knows it better than you do.
Yes,
because
exactly.
they're actually living it, right? They're saying,
they're having to live these words.
The words are coming out of their mouth, not yours. It's coming out of your head when it's coming out of her mouth.
Right.
And were her performances great? Or were they?
She was a very capable actress.
Good.
She was terrific.
All right, good. So, I want to get off of TV a little bit. I know that you're very well known for your TV comedy work, but you've also written for theater. So I'd like to talk about some of your musical theater writing as well, because we have that in common, obviously. What is it about theater that draws you to the theater, aside from the great storytelling, which we know that's what you love? But is there something about
theater?
It's
the live audience. I mean, it's what attracted me to sitcom too. It's about playing to the live audience,
getting that feedback, that instant energy. Yeah.
Yes, because you can't fake it in front of a live audience. You have to tell them the truth, and you do get instant feedback.
Well, because everyone knows you weren't attracted to the theater for the money.
True, that's true.
Because there's almost no money in it, and so when you're writing the book for a musical, do you approach that differently than you do a comedy?
Absolutely, of course, because well-conceived musicals, as you know, tell the story in song. So the musical, one of the musicals that I did, Lunch, was an original story, which is certainly unusual.
Was it your story or did somebody come?
Yeah, it was my story. And so in outlining it, I would, because I'd not done a musical before, I would create a scene or a monologue that, because I wrote the book first, and I would say, this is a musical number. This is a song. This conversation.
You knew in advance. You were song spotting as you were creating.
Yeah.
Because, frequently a book will be written, a play will be written, and then they'll spot songs.
Yeah.
Right? But you did it differently. You already knew where the songs belonged as you were creating it. Were you working with your collaborators at that time?
Yes.
So it was a joint effort.
Yes.
This wasn't something that you conceived
that I did
and
not
then approached people.
No. We all worked at the same time.
And how did that come about? How did you meet the people and decide, hey, we're going to write a musical?
Through my children, actually. Steve Dorff, who continues to be was just inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. His son and my daughter were in the same class together at school. And so we were at some function, and he was talking about how he loved musical theater, and Guys and Dolls was what got him writing songs. And I was saying I loved musical theater too. And he said, well, you know, I work with this lyricist who's always wanted to do theater. Let's do it. And so we agreed to do it. So that's how it started.
So in other words, it was a meeting of the minds.
A mutual love of theater.
And out of the blue.
Yes.
You weren't seeking one another.
No.
It just happened that way.
It was just happened.
And it was a happy collaboration, I assume.
Yes, it was wonderful.
And that show has had more than one set of productions, right?
Yes.
And, musicals are trick. They're just a massive trick. When you're conceiving the characters for Lunch, when you were conceiving those characters, did you do anything differently to conceive those characters than you would for anything else?
Only in that I knew that they had to be musical. You know, I knew that they were going to be singing. Mm-hmm. They had to be characters, because I think in a musical, a character has to be taken to a place emotionally where there's nothing else they can do but sing. Mm-hmm. It's the only way they can express themselves. So I had to conceive of situations that would take a character to those places.
Well, of course, okay, so let's talk about that for 2 seconds, because there are plenty of musicals out there that came from some other source. So you get The Lion King, which comes from, well, that was a movie musical, but you can look at Shrek, which really wasn't a movie musical, and they turned that into a musical, or Young Frankenstein, or The Producers, which are not musicals. Right. So you're looking for those moments in which you can translate
or
it into
let's say
song.
Waitress, because all the ones that you other named were kind of show business theme.
Yes.
Waitress. Here's a
movie,
a book, and then a movie that takes place in a diner.
Right. And so, how would you think that they would have approached? I mean, you weren't there, I wasn't there, but they would have approached it where they're looking for how do you take these characters and find those musical places?
Right. I just think the musical is lovely. I think it's even better than the movie. I think the music really enhanced the honesty and the truth of the characters, mm-hmm. and I think my imagination would be that. The composer,
Sarah Bareilles, was
right,
it,
who's an actress herself, got inside these characters and gave them musical voices.
Okay, so back to Lunch. When you were conceiving Lunch and you were trying to get to these places in which the character was being very musical, as you say, was there something that you were looking for? Is it something that you just identified as it was happening, or did you contrive, I guess would be the right word, to get it to that place?
No, it was just a feeling.
Just a feeling. You were just looking for your guts to talk to you.
Yeah.
Would you say you're a gut writer?
Oh, totally.
You're totally a gut writer.
Completely
you're
from
not,
instinct.
It's not. You're not sitting there cogitating and intellectualizing and.
No. Interestingly enough, my writing has improved since I've started teaching. You know, I never read a book or had a class on writing. So
you're natural.
So that I would go, oh, that's called an inciting incident. Oh, that's there were suddenly labels to these things that were just a part of telling a story to me.
You became a writer and a storyteller because you understood it innately, intuitively. And I think that most of us are, by the way. I think that we tell each other stories all day long.
Yes.
And we're all natural storytellers, and that's how we communicate. And then the question is, can you form it into something that other people can
relate to as well?
Exactly. Yeah. And then as you're relating it to them and they relate to it, that they recognize the story is being told to them. That's part of the storytelling process.
Yes.
Because obviously if you put, if I said bus, wheel, curb, that's not a story. But if you take all that and turn it into something that follows these academic labels, as you say, which is, I think, true. I've become a better writer, I think, because I understand those things too. I, like you, for most of the years that I wrote in Hollywood, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just doing it. So I think we come from the same school on that. And I think it is helpful to know that this is the way that stories work, right? That they work this way.
Absolutely.
You start with the normal world, you go to inciting incident, and so on, the plot points. It helps because then you're not wondering, does this make sense or not?
And for people who are not natural storytellers, it gives them touchstones to help them tell a story.
Absolutely. So we were talking about teaching. We've gotten off on that, which is, I think, perfectly good segue. You've been teaching for a pretty fair chunk of time now, more than a decade, isn't it?
Yes.
You're more than a decade of teaching. What would you say for novice incoming screenwriters? What would you say are the regular and biggest mistakes that you see that they could absolutely correct fairly easily? Or maybe not so easily.
Well, something that I try to encourage every screenwriter that I give notes to is to go inside themselves and find out, why am I telling this story? Why is it important for me to tell this story? Because there's always a reason. Why is this? What in me is touched by this story? What am I trying to say? Aristotle said stories tell us the way we should live our lives. And I think in a certain way that's true of every story. So one of the mistakes I think that novice writers make is they put themselves outside of the story and they're just a recorder, an observer, as opposed to taking personal ownership of the story.
So in other words, you're teaching your students that they must find it within themselves and what that story is and what its meaning is to them. I do think that when in school, I've certainly seen it happen more than once, where because the assignment is to go write a script, you get back an assignment of writing a script rather than something that does come from a place that has meaning.
Right. And it's like, okay, Star Wars has already been written multiple times.
But let's rewrite it.
Right, and the difference between fan fiction of Star Wars and a personal story is you can tell an outer space story, but where's your personal connection? What is it in this story that's your truth?
What do you think you focus on most with writers, your students? What do you focus mostly on?
Depends on what I'm teaching.
Well, of course, yes. And that's a poor question, so you're right to point that out. It does depend on what you're teaching. What do you focus on in plot? What do you most concern yourself about when you're teaching how to plot a story out?
I think it differs with every story. What you've revealed this too soon. Think about revealing this surprise later in the story, or tell me sooner what the jeopardy is.
Do you think you focus on structure a lot, or you don't worry about structure?
It just depends. If I'm reading a script that's well structured, I'll definitely compliment them on the structure, and then we'll focus on the character.
Sure.
Right.
Would you say that the majority of student scripts that you see, because I think I know the answer, but I'm curious to hear you say it, the majority of student scripts you see are character-driven or plot-driven?
Plot-driven.
Plot-driven. Would you say that they could be improved by being more character-driven?
Yes.
I think that that's absolutely true, and I find the same thing, that it's very difficult for a young person without a lot of life experience to figure out how to make the character drive the tale.
It's true. I think that every story is really about a relationship, finding those relationships. The relationships are what move the story forward, move the plot forward. Although I just want to clarify a difference, and that is I do a lot of the time hear from students that, I don't have any stories. I'm only 19.
Of course.
Right? I don't have any stories, so I've got nothing to tell. And John Updike has this wonderful quote that I'm going to misquote horribly, where he's saying that in the first 20 years of their lives, a writer has enough emotional experiences to last them an entire career, because nothing is ever as powerful or as memorable or as prescient as that first time that it happens.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that's true.
I think there's probably a lot to be said for that. The question is whether you can get it out of your head, right, or get it out of your heart.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's the key, I think.
Right. So when you first started teaching, you had never taught before, right? Other than in limited ways.
Right. I'd done seminars, and I'd never thought of it as teaching. I spent almost 4 years in Moscow explaining to them the Hollywood system of how to do a TV show, and in a certain way that's teaching, but formal teaching, not so much.
And would you say, from your first years of doing this, do you think that you've changed in any way in the way that you teach?
Oh, absolutely.
What would you say that you've from a process-wise? This show focuses on process, so I'm curious what you now do differently that you perhaps didn't do back then.
Something that I do differently now in my intro to screenwriting class that has been wonderfully helpful is on the very first day of class, after we, go through all of the stuff and the syllabus and everything, I pair up the students. I don't allow them to pair themselves up. Before class begins, I pair them up and I give them 20 minutes to go and interview each other.
Okay.
And then they have to come to class and introduce us to the person they interviewed by telling us their story.
Oh, nice.
And so what it does for me as the teacher is it lets me know who are my natural storytellers in this class, who already know what a story is, and it brings the class together because nobody's a stranger anymore. We all know each other. And certainly the people that have interviewed each other, they're freshmen. So, they're just all coming for the first time.
And most of them don't know one another either.
Right. So that's a little something that I do differently now. I try to, over the years of experience, one of the joys of teaching in this kind of environment is seeing the artistic and personal maturing of the students.
Yep, definitely.
And I now keep that in mind when I'm teaching a class. Are these freshmen? Are these sophomores? Are they juniors?
At what level of maturation are they?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think that's it. Kind of is a little bit in your face as a freshman. There's no avoiding it.
It comes back to one of the important things that I try to tell students when they're sitting down to write a screenplay or a web series or whatever it is. One of the most important questions is, who is your audience? Who are you telling this story to?
A vital question.
Right. How is the best way to reach them?
I can't tell you how many times I ask that question and they don't have an answer, which means they haven't given it any thought at all. And so that makes them think, well, wait a minute, are you just writing it, to placate an assignment?
Assignment in school.
Or are you writing it because you know exactly who you want to speak to? Sometimes they're just speaking to themselves.
And that's okay, too.
And that is okay.
But
in fact, sometimes that's great.
Yeah, as long as they know that that's who their audience is.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about Moscow. Let's talk about some of your international work, because I think some of that is fascinating. You spent how many years in Moscow?
Almost 4 years. I was home based there.
That's amazing. And so do you speak Russian?
Da. My Ruski is kranayet.
There's no reason to swear at me, Rick.
Which means my Russian is crippled. It's not very good. When we were working on sitcom and what is a sitcom, I knew that I would get a guaranteed laugh from the room if I tried to say it in Russian because my accent was so terrible.
Were they laughing with you or at you?
It didn't matter. I just wanted to laugh.
So what took you from America and your career in Hollywood to where you suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, decided that this is a new path for you?
Well, I think one of the things about life and show business in particular is recognizing opportunities that you didn't necessarily plan for yourself. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I think is even more important is for a writer to know when it's time for an actor to leave a scene.
Okay.
And I think that that's true in life, too. I worked on 24 consecutive seasons of television, and I was
that's a lot.
So blessed and lucky, and it was wonderful. It's time to get off the merry-go-round and let somebody else have their turn. So I was at a...
Were you burnt out?
No, I wasn't burnt out at all. I was loving what I was doing.
You were looking for a re-energization of some sort. Or
I
a
was
change
looking
of,
to give somebody else a turn.
Okay.
I went in to pitch a pilot at the network and was pitching to one of my daughter's classmates that I knew growing up. She was an adult and an executive at the network and had been to college and all of that.
Right.
And she couldn't stop saying Mr. Hawkins to me, and we were relating about her pets and da, da, da. And I went, it's time for me to let someone else do this. I know when to leave a party, And so I was at a place where I was going, it's time for me to find another adventure in storytelling.
Okay.
And I get a phone call from my agent going, I have to make this phone call. You don't want to move to Russia, do you? And I said, wait, hold the phone. Because at this point, my youngest child was a senior in high school.
Okay.
And was
about to be an empty
right?
nester.
And I was like, I can do this.
There's nothing stopping you.
Right. And so I said, tell me more. And it was a job that was supposed to be a 6 week consultantship, and I ended up being there almost 4 years.
And consultants doing what? I know we alluded to it in the opening.
It's a great business model that Sony Telepictures International created, the people at Sony. Before the fall of communism, there was one government-controlled television network.
Right.
And after the fall of communism, there were all of these networks and subsidies, also government-controlled,
Yes.
but they had no product. And so Sony had this great idea of sending professionals who'd done this, directors, writers, cinematographers, to come over to them and to teach them the Hollywood system. And at the same time, particularly the writers, he said, I want you to understand the culture and the audience, and then go through the library of shows that we own, because they own Columbia, they own all the MGM library, and see if there are shows that we could adapt to the various countries.
Okay.
For example, we did Married with Children, Who's the Boss, I Dream of Jeannie, all of these.
Everybody Loves Raymond.
Everybody Loves Raymond. All of these Russian adapted versions of successful TV series.
You took the actual scripts and translated them and then made them fit for that culture?
Yes. We took the concepts and adapted them so that they would work for the Russian culture and the Russian audiences. So sometimes there were big changes and other times they fit perfectly.
And how challenging was it to do that?
It was enormously challenging. It was a huge, first of all, it was enlightening because you really saw how we were alike and how our cultures were different.
Okay, good.
Which is, a wonderful experience to have in any circumstance.
So there's transliteration and there's translation.
Right.
And you needed it to be transliterated first, and then somebody to figure out how to make it work for a true translation that was then adapted further for the culture, correct?
Yes, so that we would go in and be the authorities on this is how you shoot it, this is the system that you use, this is, all of this, and they would be the students. When we were adapting it, we were the students listening to them about their culture
right.
and how it works. For example, there's a lot of bathroom humor in Married with Children.
Right.
Bathroom humor is not funny to Russians, and all you have to do is have experienced a public Russian bathroom to understand why. And so none of that would work. And also, he was one to rail against the government and and none of that was acceptable in those terms. And yet the relationship between the husband and wife was universal. Was
right.
literally universal. They understood the dynamic, and the children.
Al and Peg Bundy.
Right.
Yes. And did you keep
Gina Buchan was his name.
Gina Buchan?
Gina Buchan was Al Bundy.
And did you find that the Russian performers and the technicians and so on were absolutely paying attention to what you were saying, or did they divert from what you were saying?
They were excellent students.
Excellent students. And they were hungry probably to find out how this works.
They were so eager. They so wanted to learn because we would pull together scientific writers and journalists and medical writers who wanted to be TV writers. Mm-hmm. And it was a whole different style of writing than they were used to. Although, there is great Russian film and wonderful Russian theater, so they understood the creative art of storytelling.
Did you speak Russian before you went over there?
Not at all.
So how, when they would actually get to the translation, how would you know that what they were doing was actually working?
I had an excellent interpreter who went to the American University and was fluent in Russian, and he would help me. And immeasurably.
And did it ever get where you really were, it crossed wires where you thought that meant something, but it actually meant something else?
Oh, all the time.
All the time. And how would you correct that? Would you just say, no, that's not it?
We would discuss, and particularly for comedy, slang words that we use that have double meanings, in a translation, we would look it up and go, oh, well, let's try this word. And they go, oh, no, you can't say that. It's just the magic of language.
And how many different shows do you think you did over there? I know we talked four
we did
already.
Comedies and we did telenovelas.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 2 telenovelas. 4 or 5 comedies.
That's amazing. So you were there almost 4 years doing that.
Yes. The interesting thing about Russians is, I don't even know if we have time for this, if you want to even talk about this, but
happy to talk about it.
They're Americans. We identify Americans as, no matter where you are, if you work hard enough, if you apply yourself, you can be anything that you want to be. That's sort of the Horatio Alger.
That's America.
American identity. Russian identity is being a survivor. Just from the weather alone, but they pride themselves in being able to survive anything. So that when we would go into them and say, you'll save yourself 3 days, it'll be a lot easier if you do it this way, they're not interested in that. They wouldn't be interested at all. But if we would come in and say, well, there's a way we do it in Hollywood, but there's no way you can learn it here, then
the challenge was
right.
out.
And then they would do it and say, look, and we did it 2 days in less time than you did. And interestingly enough, as I said earlier, normally you're on a 5-day shoot in America doing a sitcom, and they would do 3 episodes in 6 days, 2 days per episode.
Okay.
So that there were 11 seasons of Married with Children, and in a year and a half, we shot every single episode that they had done in 11 seasons.
Wow.
So then, and the series had changed. It was slightly different. The relationships were different and all. The Russian writers wanted to write new episodes because it was a really popular show.
And at that point, they understood the show.
Yeah, right. The American creators did not want them to write original episodes.
Really?
So the Writers Guild, the wonderful Writers Guild, pro-union, pro-Writers Guild, the best thing to ever happen to any writer is the Writers Guild, came in to arbitrate. And basically what they did was they said, let the Russian writers write 3 new episodes, let the American writers write 3 new episodes, and let the network decide which they prefer to go with.
Wow. And so you made 11 seasons in a year and a half?
Yes.
I did not know that.
They shot 3 episodes in 6 days, and they never took a day off. You just kept working. So for the writers, you are cranking out these episodes like crazy.
No kidding. There was no burnout factor on that? People weren't totally exhausted?
I can't say enough that Russians' identity is in surviving difficult situations.
They're just tough people.
Yeah.
Right? I think that makes a lot of sense. Weren't you burnt out?
It was energizing and exhausting.
I can't even imagine. Was it very popular when it played?
Oh, it was like the #1 show. Oh, and again, I was saying there's a dearth of product. It aired every night of the week, Monday through Thursday, and on Friday and Saturday, it was a rerun from that week. So it was a new episode every night of the week.
Wow.
Which is why they had to keep cranking them out.
Well, of course, yeah. So you were getting 5.
And it was the #1 show. It just got amazing ratings.
Okay, I learned a whole bunch new today. That's for sure. Give us a little bit of advice on pitching. What is your methodology for pitching, or what do you advise people?
Well,
about pitching?
as I was saying earlier, if you can get your kids to laugh, if you
Yes.
can get your kids to understand it
Sure.
and on board,
Then you're pretty good to
right?
go.
You're putting on a show. You believe in what you're doing.
Do you think of yourself as being a very good pitcher?
I do. I had a pretty good reputation for pitching. People would oftentimes bring me in to pitch, even though they knew they weren't going to buy the show, but they just wanted a break in the afternoon.
Well, my knowing you a little bit over these past the years, I would say that you're probably an outstanding pitcher. Even though I've never actually heard you pitch a story in a room, I can just picture you as being a very energetic, enthusiastic, smart pitcher of stories. You've obviously also taken a lot of pitches from people, correct?
Sure.
Okay,
Because every
as a
storyline somebody's pitching.
Right. So tell me what it is that you've observed over time that novice writers do poorly in pitching that they could improve. What is a technique or a trick for pitching that people, because this is a question that gets asked all the time. How do I pitch a story and sell it? What can you tell someone that you've observed people doing poorly that didn't sell a pitch that you could tell them either don't do that or do it differently?
What always sells me on a pitch is the character's relationship.
Okay.
You know, instead of coming in and saying, this is a story about the drug industry and a drug czar. It's a story about a man, a slightly successful or a not so successful high school chemistry teacher who discovers he has cancer and wants to provide for his family, and he uses chemistry to become a drug lord. I'm interested in him. I'm not interested in the drug business.
Sure.
The story.
We don't
The
write about
Godfather is about an Italian family. It's not about the mafia,
Absolutely.
really.
We don't sell stories to Hollywood that are about places, events, or things. It's
It's
always
about
about people
people.
and their relations and
With
the
other
and conflict that they have,
Right.
right? And so you observed that there were many pitches over time in which somebody was trying to pitch you an arena or a background, but not about the relationships.
Right.
Okay, that's incredibly wise. That's very valuable. Well, Rick, this has been an unbelievably fast-paced, believe it or not, hour and 5 minutes. So we're coming toward the end of the show, and I'm curious if you have I'm sure you must have an oddball, quirky, weird, funny, indelible story that you can relate to us from your long experience.
I do have I have a story that is very relatable to today.
Great.
I did a series once where one of the characters had a very straightforward, a female Marine, by the book Marine, had this crush on the Vice President of the United States, and she was just apoplectic. She would just fall apart at the mention of his name. She would swoon. And it was Dan Quayle.
Okay.
And regardless of your political leanings, vice presidents are always the butts of joke,
Of course.
regardless.
Of course.
Because it seems like a pointless position, even though that's not necessarily the case.
Well, you need the backstop.
Right. Anyway, but in this particular version, we weren't so much making fun of Dan Quayle as we were this character's reaction to him. So we did an episode where he came to the base where she was stationed, and she was getting all ready, and then he couldn't make it, but he made the phone call to say, I'm not going to be able to be there.
Okay.
And she was the only person in the office, so she got to talk to him.
Good.
And obviously we shot it in front of a live audience, but we were invited to Washington, D.C. to shoot his side in his office with Dan Quayle.
Okay.
And he invited me and my wife and some other people to dinner at their home the night before, and I was blown away by how gregarious and charming, what a terrific human being he was. It was not necessarily my political leanings, but a more charming, intelligent, outgoing. I couldn't believe it in all the clips and everything that I'd seen. He was like He was like a great pro at a country club.
Really?
He didn't know a stranger. He and his wife both. It was, and I'm thinking the whole evening, it was a lovely evening at their home. This shoot tomorrow is going to be a piece of cake. This is going to be great. And he only had so much time to do it. We get to his office, we rehearse it, he does the phone call, he's funny, he's making his jokes, he is so charming. We get ready to shoot, they turn on the lights are on, we get ready for action, and his chief of staff and his wife, they all come in because they want to see it. And the minute that those cameras came on, suddenly this personable Dan Quayle suddenly carried the mantle of the Vice President of the United States. He took the position so seriously. He had such respect that all of that charm and all of that humanness were just gone from him.
And he went stiff again.
He was just, I'm the Vice President. and of course, at the time we were like, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And ultimately it was a really easy fix because I lied. I told him that we had a technical problem with the microphones and that we just needed to get the audio, that he could relax. We had everything perfect on camera, that we're just running the line. So just relax and have the audience and the people left. This is just a technical thing to have, right? And we kept the cameras running.
Right.
And because it was just us, he was smiling and charming, and we got exactly what we wanted on film. But in retrospect, I'm looking at that now and thinking about the serious nature of someone who is a public servant, who has this respect for their office and the mantle of their office, that who they are as a person takes a back seat to that.
How interesting.
Yeah, and I have a whole different appreciation of that
But
now.
you can say you lied to the face of the Vice President
Well,
of the United
that's
States.
one way that you could look at the story. But after the show aired, we heard from the White House. They called the line producer on the show and said, how did you do that? How did you light it? We've never seen him so
natural looking,
Yeah,
like a
well-
human being and not a robot, because he had a little bit of a tendency to come
took
off
his
robotic.
job. He took his job seriously.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, and last question. Do you have a solid piece? You've given us tons of tips and advice throughout this whole thing. Do you have one overarching tip or piece of advice you can give us?
Yes. And I think that this is the one, if I could only give one piece of advice to somebody, and that is, there is one and only one definition of success.
Okay.
And it's not about ratings. It's not about awards. It's not about accolades. Success is being able to pay the rent doing something that you love. So to young people who are starting out, think about what your goal is. And I'm not saying don't dream big, but I'm saying understand that you can be a successful writer going to work and doing a job that you love and that you do well, and that's the award.
The success is for you.
Yes.
And not necessarily how many cars you have and how big your house is.
Right. How your bank account, how famous you are. In fact, that's the best part about being a writer, is that you don't have to deal with fame.
That's true.
In general. Those are all the negative aspects, as far as I'm concerned, of show business. Being able to tell a story to a lot of people and they pay you for it. I mean,
self-satisfaction.
Yes.
I think that's very wise, because a lot of people have anxiety about what they're doing and so on, and they don't find any satisfaction.
They
in
put
what they do.
themselves down. This isn't it. Nobody know. Or I didn't get nominated for that award, or I only got honorable mention, and it isn't about the awards.
Well, if you want to be a writer and successful, this is for sure. This is absolutely true. And you have set out, and your goal is to make a lot of money and win awards, you're not going to succeed.
Right. And you're not going to be happy.
And you're not going to be happy. I think happiness is part of that success, as you say. If you're not happy with what you're doing and you're making a lot of money, what's the point?
Yes. Why are you? It's too much work.
Exactly. Well, this has been very wise advice, and Rick, this has been terrific. This has been just a great episode of StoryBeat, and I know people are going to get a lot out of it.
It's just so nice to have this conversation, and we're not talking about school stuff.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thanks for stopping by StoryBeat.
Good luck with the podcast.
Thanks so much. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.